Hello and welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. I am Carrie Williams, Associate Director of Alumni Events here at York University. Thank you for joining us for today's lecture titled The Impact of Russian Sanctions in Canada. That's by Perry Sadorsky, Professor, Sustainability and Economics in the Schulich School of Business. I accept the responsibility to acknowledge the land that I am on. Because we are not all gathered in the same space, the land I'm about to acknowledge might not be for the territory that you are on. Excuse me. Please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on. The website native-land.ca is a good resource for this. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. York acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement to peaceably care and share the Great Lakes region. Before we introduce our speaker, I'd like to take a moment to tell you about the alumni survey we are currently conducting. As some of our most valuable community members, we are inviting all York U alum to participate in and help shape our future by completing the survey. Your responses will help us to better understand how to communicate with you and ensure we are providing you with engagement opportunities that meet your needs. Please check your inbox for an email titled "Your Opinion Matters." Complete our alumni survey from York University alumni. The email address should be in the chat there. It will just take you 10 minutes to complete the survey and provide your insights. Upon completion, you'll be given an option to enter a draw to win one of 10 $250 MasterCard gift cards. If you didn't receive the survey, please contact us at alumni@yorku.ca and we will send you a unique survey link. Before we get started with the lecture, we'd like to do a quick poll. Today's question is, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? The poll should pop up on your screen right now, and I'll give everyone a moment to respond. Here. Okay, so majority are somewhat to minimally informed about the topic. So really appreciate you giving us that feedback. It's always helpful for our speaker as well to know who's in the audience. If you need help with the Zoom webinar, please feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter your question there. Our team is ready to help you. That same button may be used to submit questions to our speaker to answer during the Q&A portion of the presentation. Please know that all of your questions and comments are visible to our panelists and staff working behind the scenes. So we ask that you keep your questions relevant and respectful. Today's talk will be given by Perry Sadorsky, Professor of Sustainability and Economics with the Schulich School of Business. His research focuses on business issues related to energy, the natural environment, and financial markets. Today, he will give us an overview of how the recent sanctions on Russia affect Canada economically and demographically. He will delve into whether these sanctions represent opportunities or threats to the Canadian economy and how these sanctions affect Canada's role in the global economy. We're so pleased that he could join us here today. And Professor Sadorsky, you can turn on your camera now. Thank you. I'll be back after your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much for that nice introduction. Okay, can you see my screen here?
Yes, it looks great. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. All right, so I'll get started then. So thanks for that introduction and thanks for inviting me to present today. Let me get started with a few plots of data. So I'm going to keep this entertaining and fun. We'll have a couple of polls as we work through. I thought I'd just start off by talking about one of the main indicators of what's been going on with regards to the Russian sanctions. And that's been the exchange rate between the Russian ruble and the US dollar. And before the sanctions, the ruble was trading around 75 to 80, meaning that one American dollar was buying between 75 and 80 Russian rubles. And then when Russia invades the Ukraine, the ruble starts to rise very sharply to 100, 110, 120, 130. And then the ruble backs off a bit. There's sort of a sawtooth pattern. And then if you look at the top panel on the right there, my chart was created last week. It was around 80, I don't know, 87, I think. And today the ruble is at 83. Well, 83 is pretty close to where the ruble was before the sanctions were imposed. So what sanctions? What's going on here? All right, so one of the things is that when a central bank wants to intervene in the foreign currency market to stabilize their currency, what they usually do is they enter the foreign exchange market and they start buying their domestic currency. Now, this option is not available to the Russian central bank because half of their foreign currency reserves are held outside of Russia in countries that are sanctioning them. So what about a workaround? So Russia's workaround is to require all exporting companies in Russia to convert 80% of their export proceedings to rubles. In other words, instead of having the Central Bank of Russia stabilize the currency, Russia is enforcing that commodity exporters are the ones that take on this role. And it's worked remarkably well. That basically explains what's happened to the ruble. So the ruble's back around 83. So, just to recap, what's happening is that the Russian exporters are converting 80% of their export earnings back to rubles, and that stabilized the currency. The other thing about sanctions is that, quite honestly, there hasn't been any impact on the Russian commodity sector at all. They're still exporting pretty much as much commodities as they want. The sanctions have been more focused on the consumer. So I'll talk about that in a few minutes, but just so if you want to think about sanctions, we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. The lower plot shows oil prices, and oil prices have been rising throughout the year because we're coming out of COVID, economic activity is picking up. You see a sharp spike in oil prices when the war first started. Oil prices settled back, sort of a sawtooth pattern. And again, the oil market is not overreacting to this. All right, just quickly, if you want to get an idea of what oil prices are going to look like in the future, you can look at something called the futures curve. This is West Texas Intermediate Oil Futures Curve. And you can read across the horizontal axis gives the number of months forward we're looking. If we look about 1 year out from today, the crude oil market is roughly pricing oil at about $94 a barrel. So if you want a rough estimate of what the future looks like, that would be one way to get it. Now, where the sanctions are biting is on the equity side. So the top plot is the share price of Sberbank, which is Russia's largest bank, trading around $15 a share. Equities were suspended from trading in the United States. Upon suspension, Sberbank was down about 52 cents a share. The plot below is a plot of an ETF that tracks the Russian equity market. So in the US and other countries sanctioning, equities have been suspended from trading, and Russia is effectively not investable, at least from an equity perspective. Okay, so what about trade? Well, Canada actually does very little trade with Russia. Last year, Canadian imports from Russia were a little less than $1 billion. The main imports were minerals, fertilizers, chemicals. Canadian exports to Russia were about $500 million. The main exports were machinery, electrical equipment. And just by comparison, Canadian exports to the US were about $400 billion last year, and imports in the US were about $240 billion. So we're talking about 0.5% in terms of Russian exports if you were to look at that relative to the US. So Canada really does very, very little trade with Russia. Some countries affected, you probably have heard about some of this. Canadian Tire, well, they sell their Kelly Hansen line in Russia. They've suspended that. Ken Ross is trying to sell a big gold mine. Magna and Linamar are auto producers, Canadian auto producers. Magna, I thought, was the most interesting. If you just look at the share price of Magna, well, it dropped quite a bit. It basically went from about $80 down to $55. It's recovered a little bit. Magna says that they don't really make that much money from its operations in Russia, but it's large enough to have an impact on the share price. So this is the one that's probably the most, it shows the most dramatic impact of the sanctions there. All right, carbs. Well, it's lunchtime, and I'm not talking about food that you eat, but I am talking about the carbs group of countries: Canada, Australia, Russia, Brazil, South Africa. These countries are important because they control collectively assets worth about $60 trillion, and they produce between 25% and 50% of most major commodities. So if you have never heard of the carbs, at least outside of the food group, then this is your introduction to them. There's 2 developed countries, Canada and Australia, and 3 countries from the emerging side. All right, so what impact does Russia have then? Well, we don't, as I said, we don't have a lot of direct trade between Canada and Russia. So the impact is mostly felt through the fuel, metals, and the food markets. You hear food and fuel being mentioned the most, but also through the metal markets. So Russia's a top 5 global producer of steel, nickel, aluminum, all very important products. At the beginning of March, we had an example of the classic short squeeze, the nickel short squeeze, the London Metal Exchange. So what's that all about? Well, that's a picture of trading at the London Metal Exchange. Okay, the London Metal Exchange was started in 1877. It's one of the oldest trading exchanges in the world. It trades metals, industrial metals. So examples would be aluminum, copper, nickel, lead, zinc, gold, silver, mostly for the industrialized sector. The picture you're looking at is a picture of the ring trade. It's open outcry. It's one of the last exchanges in the world to use the open outcry method. You have a picture of 2 guys there. They're getting pretty animated. It takes about a year to learn how to trade in the ring. You have to know the verbal commands, and you also have to know the hand signals. A lot of the trading is done with hand signals, and you certainly want to be confident that you're buying and selling the right thing in the right order. It's a very curious market because the way they trade a large group of commodities. They have 2 sessions, morning session, afternoon session. They trade in 5-minute blocks, 5-minute increments. So they'll be trading aluminum for 5 minutes, and then the bell rings, and that's it. Then we move on to copper. So it's a very curious way of conducting the trade, but it's quite effective. The prices are very important. The prices that settle on the London Metal Exchange are used for benchmarking prices for these commodities all over the world. So what's the short squeeze? Well, traders typically take out short positions either for hedging or if they're making a bet that a commodity price will fall. A short position basically means you sell something you don't own with borrowed money, and then you buy it back later at hopefully a lower price. So it's the inverse of long trading. Long trading is you buy low and sell high. Here you sell high and you buy low. Okay, so it's basically making a bet that the commodity price is going to decline. And the squeeze comes in when there's an unexpected bump in the price. And when that happens, it forces traders to make a decision. Do they want to exit their trade? If they do, they exit the trade by buying. Prices are shooting up because of an unexpected event. And then you have all the traders also buying to close their positions. That's what's called the short squeeze. And it was a biggie. It was a biggie. It's the biggest one on the London Metal Exchange history. Nickel trades dollars per ton, 20,000 US dollars per ton, and it shot up to over $1 million per ton, completely collapsed the market. The market was closed for over a week. They tried several times to restart and they couldn't seem to get a settlement price. Things have calmed down a bit now. This happened on March 7th, so it's been about a month. Things have calmed down a little bit more, but that's the classic short squeeze. So a number of traders were faced with very large bills to try to close out. It took a while to clear everything. So that's the short squeeze. It's a historic one because it's the largest one that's ever happened on US, on the LME. In terms of the contract, in case you're wondering, nickel's traded in lots of 6 tons. So if you buy a contract of nickel on the LME, you better have space for 6 tons of nickel coming your way. That's the, as I said, it's an industrial, mostly industrial trading is done there. All right, Russia's a large oil and natural gas exporter. They're one of the top exporters in both oil and natural gas. So this is a plot, a chart of the exports of oil. Saudi Arabia is the top oil exporter, Russia 2, Canada is in there at number 4, Iran, UAE, Nigeria, Kuwait, Norway. You can see that the exports are really concentrated in the probably first 4 countries or so. And this is a good place for us to put up our first poll. So I'll ask Christina to pop up a poll. Which country is the largest producer of oil in the world? And it's multiple choice: Saudi Arabia, Russia, or the United States. What do you think? Well, we have a good breakdown. Slight advantage to Saudi Arabia. The answer is the United States. They are now the world's largest oil producer. They're also the largest consumer, true, but they're the largest producer. The shale revolution has really had a huge impact. They've gone from basically a net importer of oil, crude oil to an exporter. Okay, good. So the next one is, okay, so as I mentioned with regarding to the stabilization of the ruble, so the export sector for the raw materials has not really been impacted. If you've been following the media, they haven't really impacted the oil and natural gas. Western Europe is a huge buyer of Russian oil and natural gas. Those products have not been sanctioned in any way. The thought was with sanctions, the word would get around and maybe somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 million barrels of Russian oil would not be exported. It would disappear from the market. That didn't happen. Where is it? Well, the chart shows you there's a lot of activity along, well, we'll call it dark activity. Basically, what's been happening is Russian oil tankers have been turning off their GPS positioning systems. In other words, it's by marine law that all ships have to be tracked through a positioning system. And so the Russian tankers have been turning off their positioning, so we don't know where they are, okay? We do know that demand for Russian oil was high because it's trading at a premium. Okay, basically it's trading $30 below the world benchmark. So if you're looking to buy cheap oil and you're not concerned about sanctions, Russian oil may fit the bid. So they're not really having a problem finding customers to buy their product, but the fact that their ships have gone dark is definitely a concern. So we don't know where they are, and you know, we don't know where they're going to be docking either. Okay, this is the natural gas picture. Yes, natural gas. So this is a big factor for Europe. Russia is a huge exporter of natural gas, by far the biggest exporter in the world. US is in there too, Qatar, Norway. Australia is all LNG, liquefied natural gas. Canada is all pipelines. Light blue is pipelines, dark blue is liquefied natural gas. But you can see that Russia is a huge exporter of natural gas. Okay, so one of the concerns was that if oil prices continue to rise, we're going to have what's called a supply shock, where an important input into our economy is going to experience a sudden rise in price. We call it a supply shock. Oil supply shocks were very common during the 1970s. Not a concern, really, to be honest with you, because our economy is a lot less energy intensive, and we've also moved to a lot of fuel switching. So the shocks that people talk about from the 70s are unlikely to happen, but there will be some pricing pressure from commodity movements. Okay, there's a lot on the plot. I just want to mention there's a light blue line which shows energy intensity. For Canada, it starts at 120, it's an index, and it ends at about 80. So there's been about a 33% decrease in energy intensity. So all developed countries have gone through this. So we're not as dependent on oil as we were maybe back in the 1970s or so. And we're doing a transition. We're in a transition phase. We're going from oil, that's an oil jack working on the Texas prairies, to renewables. And there's a couple wind turbines, and we've got some solar panels, and we're making a major shift towards that. This I thought was interesting. This is quite recent. If you're thinking about electricity generation in the US, I think a few people found this very interesting. So right now, the #1 source of electricity generation for the US is natural gas. #2 is renewables. Yeah, go renewables. #3 is nuclear, and 4 is coal. Coal has had a huge drop off since about 2008, 2009. And the other is just this reminiscent part down here. So in terms of electricity generation, the US has made a big change from the fossil fuel sources to the renewables. And natural gas is still a fossil fuel, that's true. Cleaner, but still fossil fuel. But it's nice to see the renewables making a comeback. So the way to curb the impact of oil is really just to shift the transportation sector, because we really don't use oil in Canada or the US for anything other than transportation fuel. It's really the last area that oil has a stronghold on. So I thought I'd show you some recent developments. I got my eye on this, folks. This is the brand new 2022 Ford F-150 electric pickup. Looks pretty stylish. You would never know it's electric until you pop the hood and take a look inside, or if you open the cab and take a look, it looks a bit different. But I mean, F-150 is one of the largest selling vehicles in North America for 40 years. And for Ford to make the switch and offer an electric vehicle, I think really says something about the way we're transitioning to away from oil to other sources. If you want something bigger, this is the tractor from a big rig. QCD makes these. And then if you want some transportation for your kids, this is an electric school bus. A big shout out to Lion. They're a company based in Quebec. They are specializing in electric buses. And another shout out to this big bad boy here. This is a big yellow school bus from Green Power Motors in Vancouver. They also specialize in electric vehicles, mostly buses, transportation, vans, things like that. So I thought I'd put this up. 2 Canadian companies in electric vehicle space. Yes, it's much more than just Tesla. Christina, can we bring up the second poll here? So it's a multiple choice. Of the big 3 US automakers, which one does not have an electric vehicle? Single choice only. Yes, that's the correct answer, folks. Chrysler. Okay, Ford, I gave you the answer because I just showed you the new F-150. GM does have electric vehicle, and Chrysler is the only one of what I call them the major 3 historically. They were the big 3 US automakers. Chrysler is the only one that doesn't have an offering in the electric space. All right, what about food? Yes, okay, so there's two parts to it. First, there's the we eat food part to it. There's a second part of it, which a lot of these food products are used in the animal supply chain. In other words, they're feedstock for animals. So Ukraine accounts for about 10% of global wheat production, Russia about 20%. So if you put the two together, about 30%. I think Ukraine got their winter, they got their last round of wheat out, but right now their wheat fields are full of mud and tanks, so they're not going to be planting anything. But Russia, the UK, Ukraine account for about 30% of global wheat. Ukraine, about 50% of global corn. A lot of corn goes for feedstock for animals. Russia and Ukraine are about 30% of global barley. And then the big one on the bottom, I found this surprising. Russia and Ukraine account for 80% of global sunflower production. And I guess we could have had another multiple choice question on what does all this sunflower production end up being? And the answer is cooking oil. A lot of it goes into cooking oil. So, but you know, there's other products we can use for cooking, but sunflower is quite popular. All right, so what about Canada? Well, there's the Canadian inflation rate. I'm sure if you're watching the news, you're already familiar. The Canadian inflation rate's been rising 5.8%. The numbers are for 2 months back now. If you take out the fuel part, you get the light blue line. So the dark blue line is overall CPI, overall headline inflation, and the blue line, the light blue line, is when you take out fuel. Yes, it's less, but the point is the trend's the same. So even if you take out the fuel costs, there's still lots of other things going on there. So the impact on Canadian drivers, BNN, Bloomberg did a poll. 54% of Canadians said they were driving less. 50% said they were planning to adjust how much they drive in the future. I thought you'd find this interesting. The price of a full tank of gasoline, 60 liters, as a percentage of average monthly net salary. Well, it's the lowest in Canada and the US. So we complain about high gas prices, but in terms of our percentage of average month salary, it's on the low end. South America is a little bit higher. Europe is a little bit higher as well. India is very high, and some other parts of the Middle East. Middle Eastern countries, some of them are big oil exporters, but they don't actually refine very much. So they have to import all the refined product. So just when you go to fill up your gas tank and you're complaining about the gas price, just remember that on this chart, Canada's pretty good. All right, transitions. Well, the federal government, they've just announced that they're going to try to put in some new guidelines to reduce emissions from the oil and gas sector. They've talked about that before, but that'll maybe push the transition a little bit. If you've never thought about Ontario electricity generation, well, this is what Ontario's electricity generation looks like. The nukes, uranium, 60%, hydro, 26%, wind, 7%, natural gas, 3%, solar, 2%, and petroleum less than 1%. We retired the old coal-fired plants a number of years ago, and our electricity is pretty clean. Yes, natural gas, of course, is fossil fuel-based, but we're pretty clean overall. All right, so this is the Baltic Dry Index. It's an index of shipping costs for 20 major shipping routes around the world, and it moves around a lot. And the reason I'm showing you this is you go back to the beginning of the COVID pandemic, 2020, shipping costs were very low. They started to rise. They spiked back in October of last year. A huge problem if you look at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. Wow, the big ships were just backed up. It was like a parking lot at the mall at holiday time. They had so many ships backed up there. Shipping costs dropped a little bit, but they started rising at the beginning of the year. So a lot of what we see, the inflation rate, is already baked in from supply chain disruptions. The Russian war is going to exacerbate the problem, but it's not the source of the inflation problem. Okay, unemployment in Canada, well, that's the pandemic for you. And then we're back pretty much almost where the employment was before the pandemic. But you can see the big effect of COVID. GDP, huge drop down. Well, we haven't recovered yet, but we are in the process of recovering. What about the demographics? Well, okay, the third bullet point, Canada has the third largest population of people with Ukrainian ancestry. So they're on the move in Ukraine. Probably 4 or 5 million people have left the country. There's 44 million people in the country. 4 or 5 of them have already left. They've mostly gone to Poland. What about coming to Canada? Well, as far as I could tell, there's about 12,000 that have arrived and another 60,000 are on their way. The longer the war goes on, the more refugees Canada is going to be accepting. So this could alter the demographics in Canada. Many of these people are well educated. Ukraine has a very good education system. So there's some pretty high skilled workers that might be available for the tech sector. National defense, NATO has been relaxing, I'd say, for the last 20 years. They haven't really been doing very much in terms of operations. They've mostly been strategizing. Will the war get them to put the boots on the ground? Will they have to actually go into combat? Well, they don't want to. They clearly don't want to, but if they do, there'll be a bump up in NATO spending. Canada's pretty good. We're about 1.3% of GDP on military expenditure. It's about the same as the Netherlands. I know a lot of people complain that maybe Canada doesn't spend much on military. Certainly not as much as the US, but we're pretty good on a percentage basis there. So look for an uptick in NATO spending if the war continues. Cyber attacks. I don't know how you feel about this. Right now, the Russian cyber experts are all pretty much preoccupied. So, you know, the cyberspace has been pretty quiet for a while now, but eventually that'll pick up. Businesses, governments are vulnerable. Universities are vulnerable. Look for more resources to start addressing cybersecurity. Impact in crypto. I don't know how you feel about cryptocurrency. It gets a lot of news, sometimes not so good. Russians supposedly have about 200 billion in crypto. And globally, there's about 1.8 trillion. That's my best guess. I had a hard time trying to come up with a number. The question is, how much cryptocurrency is in the world? Well, it varies because the price of Bitcoin and whatnot changes a lot. So Russians have about 200 billion. They can't really convert their rubles to currencies or anything like that. So they have been active buyers in crypto. Whether that'll continue or not, I guess we'll see. This is a chart of Bitcoin prices, really very choppy, nothing to read in terms of a clear signal. I started the year pretty high, went down, came up, went down, came up. It's like a roller coaster, and it's about $40,000 per Bitcoin today. So we'll see if the war carrying on has any effect on the cyber world, the crypto world, things like that. And then just looking forward, so what's looking forward, Bank of Canada is going to use interest rate increases to address inflation. Recovery from COVID-19 has been pretty good. We're looking at some strong economic growth, supply chain disruptions, COVID's not over. Shanghai's locking down 25 million people. Essentially, the population of Ontario is being locked down in just one city in China. Supply chain issues are going to continue, the new normal, but no, we won't have an oil price shock like we did in the 1970s. We've reduced energy intensity and fuel switching. So the effect of Russia on the overall economy, not too strong, not a lot of direct trade. Fuel prices maybe transition away to electric vehicles. That'll cut our dependence even more on oil. Food prices, yeah, there's going to be some food price increases coming our way. And with that, I'll stop. So that concludes my presentation. Thanks for your time.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Swiderski. That was very informative, and I have so many notes. But want to let the audience know, you can feel free to stop sharing your screen now if you don't mind. Yeah. We do have time for questions. So just a reminder to the audience to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. And for any of you who are watching live on Facebook, you can submit questions there too, and just enter them into the comment section of the video and the team will send them my way, okay? So thank you for that. I have questions. I'm looking at my notes here from the Russian tankers without GPSs to carbs. I'm going to start with actually carbs.
Carbs is lunchtime.
Yeah, that's right. That was a new learning. I hadn't heard that acronym before. Okay. At the very top of your lecture, you talked a little bit about the sanctions in Russia impacting producers in Russia, but also potentially impacting consumers. And I wasn't sure if you meant consumers in Russia or consumers in other parts of the world. I wonder if you could sort of talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, okay. So actually, the commodity producers in Russia are not really impacted, except for the fact that they have to convert their export revenues to ruble.
Yeah, to rubles,
how they're maintaining that, and it's working really well. Well, the consumer side is definitely mixed. You know, if you're going to McDonald's for lunch today, you're in Russia, you're probably going to be out of luck. Most of the big name consumer products companies, Nike, McDonald's, they're all basically shut down their operations there. Canadian Tire shut down their operations as well. So the consumers are being affected. And, you know, the thing about, it's really about the exchange rate, the currency, because it's important for Russia to stabilize the currency, to build consumer confidence. It shows the war's going well and inflation is not a problem. And a couple of weeks ago, there were some pretty scary pictures about people in Russian supermarkets basically fighting over bags of sugar. And that's starting to disappear now. The inflation issue is under control. And so the consumers are affected, but not as much as we thought they were going to be affected, certainly last month. And on the production side, not as much. So you kind of are asking, you know, what's the sanctions, you know, what are the sanctions doing? And maybe not as much as we thought. So again, whenever a war breaks out, the first 2 weeks, it's just chaos. Nobody knows how to read the situation. So I want to be a consumer in Russia. I went to McDonald's for lunch yesterday. Like I said, I'm glad I did, because I probably wouldn't be doing that in Russia. But I think the prices are going to stabilize. It was all driven by the ruble. Once the ruble's back around 80 euros, $80 per US dollar, it really is stabilized a lot of the conditions.
Okay, thank you for that. We have a question from Shabazz, who asks, what is the prospect for wheat prices? At one point they had spiked, but there's talk that American farmers are growing more. So should we assume that prices will remain stable even though Ukraine is unlikely to plant?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I did show you some data on wheat production. Ukraine and Russia, about 30% of global wheat production. And farmers can rotate. They typically, well, they can't just do it quickly. They have to plant and let things grow. But that's correct. The US and Canada essentially are planning on planting more wheat. We should be okay. Okay. Where does all that Russian, Ukrainian wheat go? Well, it goes into pasta making in Italy. So that might affect our pasta. But we also provide wheat to Italy to make pasta as well. And I think the countries in Africa and the Middle East are ones that are going to be most affected, because they buy a lot of their wheat from those two countries. So I don't think Canada's necessarily going to be that affected by the wheat situation. More planting on our end, more local production on our end is going to, I think, dampen the impact. But there will be definitely price spikes in other parts of the world.
Okay. Okay. A question somewhat related to this question from Danielle. What are the opportunities for Canada, I guess, in addition to planting more wheat? We hear that the war in Europe could be going on for years, possibly involving more countries. Where should Canada direct its exports?
We do almost all of our trade with the US. So we're good. We're good on that side. We do some trade with the UK. We do some trade with countries in Asia, but we're mostly trading with the United States. So it's not really going to be a big factor for us. I don't see that. I think if you're thinking about the direct impact, spending on cybersecurity, spending on NATO expenditure is going to affect Canada. As I mentioned, NATO is going to have to make a decision eventually. Do they want to put the boots on the ground or not? If they do, it's going to drive the cost of belonging to NATO higher. I think what's interesting is going to be the refugee situation. We potentially, the government, federal government said we could potentially be bringing in as much as 1 million people from the Ukraine over the next 5 years, which is an unprecedented number of people. And they've got to find a place to live. They've got to find something to do. There's going to be some support programs, presumably, for them. So I see the social demographics as probably a bigger situation. I don't think the trade's affected very much at all, but the social demographics, I think, could be.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. One question in the Q&A for the team behind the scenes. Somebody's looking for the survey link, so we can get that out to you, the alumni survey. That's not a problem. Thanks for putting that there. A question from Valerie asks, how come Putin has stated that purchase of oil and other products to be paid with rubles, not euros?
That's just brinkmanship. So right now, so as I mentioned, right now, the Russian exporters have to convert 80% of their export proceedings to rubles. Well, the next step is just to tell countries that buy Russian exports, you have to pay in rubles. That will strengthen the ruble. And Russia has had an issue with the US dollar for over 20 years. They would like to see the US dollar weaken and the ruble strengthen. And so one way to do that, so in answer to the question, one way to do that is to force countries that trade with Russia to buy Russian goods with rubles, and that would cut the US dollar out of the transition. Okay, but the US dollar is so widely traded, I can't imagine the ruble would really ever have much of a presence in terms of international markets. But the answer is to try to strengthen the ruble, with the US dollar. A lot of things going on here that are geopolitical. I mean, it started being about the Ukraine, but let's see how far they can push it by sort of influencing global financial markets. Global trade runs on the US dollar. Everybody knows that. But Russia says, well, you want to trade with us? You gotta buy using rubles. It's just like if Canada were to say, if you want to trade with us, you got to buy Canadian dollars. People say, are you crazy? Nobody has Canadian dollars, just you Canadians. Why would we ever do that? So we'll see how badly Germany and Poland want that natural gas from Russia.
Yeah. Well, the fact that you shared about the tankers without we can't find the tankers. I'm just like, this is quite the play. It's quite the play in that. It's
yeah, well, they're big. They're big. So I mean, if you look, I'm sure you can find them. But it's basically marine law that says that all vessels have to have tracking devices, and you turn them off. Well, eventually they'll show up somewhere, but unexpectedly, I assume.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Question from David. I think this gets a little bit at a consumer question, maybe to a certain extent. Are there sanctions that could have more impact or harm for Russia?
Well, I think the biggest sanction would really be to sanction the oil and the natural gas. I think that because Russia's government revenue is almost totally dependent on oil and natural gas exports. So if there was to be a really strong message to sanction Russia, the way to do it would be to say, that's it, oil and natural gas, they're sanctioned. But the problem is that the group of countries that sanction Russia are very small. There's many countries that have no sanctions. So they say, well, those are your sanctions. They're not our sanctions. And again, Canada and the US are both self-sufficient for oil. We only trade oil with Russia as more of a goodwill. We don't really need it, right? It's more of a goodwill type of transition. So, putting sanctions on Russian oil would really put a bite to it, but it would have to be done in a way that a lot of other countries would participate. Clearly, China said that they would never do that. So they're a big buyer of Russian oil. So Russia's got one close neighbor who's buying oil anyway. So it's really hard to sanction. That's why the US tries to go for the financial side. They're trying to go indirectly. Right, they're trying to do with the sanctions. There's like another side to this is with the Russian companies. Like Gazprom is still paying dividend payments. They're still paying debt payments. People say, "Is that possible? I thought Russian banks and Russian companies were sanctioned." Well, they're using a correspondent bank. I mean, they send the dividend payments through to JP Morgan. Morgan processes it, sends it on to Citibank, and then it gets cut up all over the world. So that part of the economy is still functioning. In fact, some people, I just looked at today some numbers, some people actually think the Russian economy is growing, not shrinking, that's actually growing because it stabilized inflation. Like the stabilization of the ruble stabilized inflation. So anything's in the cards right now.
Okay, thank you for that. Question from John. We have a time for a few more questions. How high would you think fuel prices will go in the next 5 years due to the pressure of impending change to electric vehicles? And what is the possible answer? Well, actually, I'll stop there. He has another question related to charging stations, but that's the first part.
Yeah, so the one way to look at it is you have to look at the oil futures market. I showed a curve earlier on in the presentation. If you look at what the futures market is pricing oil for the next year, it's about $94, $95 a barrel. So it's a little lower than today. So the oil market is not really expecting there to be much of an impact from the Russian situation right now. The war could go on a long time, to be honest with you. I mean, this could be a 5-10 year or more ordeal, but the oil market is pretty much digested the news. And overall, we're not expecting an oil price spike. Now that's generating a lot of interest here in Canada because we're still saying, well, why are gas prices so high if oil prices have sort of leveled off? I guess there's some inquiries here going on in Ontario about that, and the US is talking about that. But I don't think oil prices are really going that higher. I think we're kind of hit the, sort of around $100 is the top end for that. So that's my view on that. As I said, oil is really all it's used for is refining to products, into gasoline. If we go electric, that's pretty much going to put a huge dent in the demand for oil here in Canada.
Okay. Thank you. Another question from Shabazz. Apart from Russia requiring countries to pay for products in rubles, there's talk about gold and crypto, as you had highlighted Russians own quite a lot. How is this likely to affect both gold and crypto in the mid to long term?
Well, gold is viewed as a safe haven in uncertain times. So if there's troubled economic waters in the economy, then gold is often a safe play. Gold hasn't responded very much to what's been going on. It's ticked up a bit. Crypto is harder to explain. It was thought that crypto is similar to gold in a safe haven investment, but over the last year, crypto has been trading much more correlated with the overall stock market. So it doesn't look like the crypto hedge is as prominent as it might have been a few years ago. There's a whole side issue with crypto. Central banks are talking about getting into crypto big time, okay? Even the Bank of Canada is talking about, well, in fact, if you look at your tax form for this year, surprise, surprise, there's a question that says, how much money did you make crypto trading? It's on your tax form, right? Now, if you're trading crypto, you might not want to report that, but they're thinking about it. So if crypto goes mainstream with central bank acceptance, then, well, we're going to have another type of currency on our on our offering here. So we'll see how that goes too.
Okay. Last question, if you'll allow it.
Sure.
You spoke about the expected volume of refugees coming from Ukraine. What do you think the impact will be on the Canadian housing market?
Well, yeah, they're going to need a place to live. And we've got tight housing in our big cities like Toronto and Vancouver. There's going to have to be some thoughts on how they're going to be settled and reallocated. As I said, skills is really not a problem. A lot of these people are very highly educated, but they're going to need some place to live. And that's been a very contentious issue. And our housing market, so I'm speaking to you from just north of Toronto here today, and our housing market is just insane. There's just too much money coming in as investment, and somehow the federal government, I think, is going to have to figure a way to help settle the refugees. I don't have an answer, but they're going to have to find a way to provide some sort of subsidized housing. We're subsidizing daycare, right? So we're gonna,
Yes.
yeah, no, seriously, like, wow,
Yeah.
what took so long? I mean, hey, you know, I'm at work. What do I do with my kids, right? Subsidized daycare. We're going to have to do something with that with respect to housing. My guess is some sort of housing subsidy program is probably going to happen. But it can't just be the developers just building more property and then auctioning it off to the highest bidder. That's not really going to help the situation.
Yeah.
Very
Okay.
interesting question, though. Very interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there are a few more questions. Unfortunately, we're not able to get to all of them. The audience is quite engaged and interested in what you had to say. So thank you so much for taking the time
Oh,
to
my
be with us
pleasure.
today. This is
My
great.
pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
You're welcome. You can feel free to turn your video off now if you'd like. For those of you who'd like to share today's session with family or friends, it will be posted on our YouTube page at youtube.com/YorkU alumni. You may also watch any of our past lectures that you might have missed. We have one more poll question for you, and that is, how would you rate your knowledge of today's topic following this discussion? That should pop up on your screen right now. Our next Scholars Hub at Home session is titled Small Town Short Work Week, Evaluating the Effects of a Compressed Work Week in Dora, Ontario, with Zachary Spicer, Associate Professor of the School of Public Policy. That happens on April 13th. You may learn more about our upcoming events, including this one at yorku.ca/alumni and friends. Again, if anybody would like the link to the survey, please contact us at alumni@yorku.ca. Otherwise, thanks so much for being with us today, and keep well.